The seeds of discontent were sown on the soils of France, but it wouldn't be until everyone returned home that these flowers began to blossom and wilt. This would start one of England's many civil wars, the Wars of the Roses. The name for the Civil War comes from the emblems of both the House of Lancaster and York, those being a red rose and a white rose respectively. These were blossomed out of the two rivaled branches of the House of Plantagenet. Along with the financial crash from the cost of the Hundred Years' War with France, there was also bastard feudalism. Edward III, reigning from 1327 to 1377, had 5 children to survive into adulthood. Edward of Woodstock, also known as the Black Prince, Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and Thomas of Woodstock. Each son would be granted a duchy created by Edward. The Black Prince would be Duke of Cornwall, Lionel would be Duke of Clarence, John would be Duke of Lancaster, Edmund would be Duke of York, and Thomas would be Duke of Gloucester. Over time, these duchies would start bringing to light the defects that were associated with bastard feudalism. This term, created in the 19th century, would refer to what lords and nobles could do, that being rendering military, political, legal, or domestic service in return for money. By the time of Richard II, these duchies were at such a height that the king had to increase his own prestige to counter the weight that the magnates had. However, by this time, the magnates had become so powerful that they could rival the king himself, much in the way that John of Gaunt and his son, Henry Bolingbroke, did to Richard. Looking to the two roses, both had claims to the English throne. The House of Lancaster descended from John of Gaunt, the third son of Edward III. This claim was preferenced by Edward himself, explicitly emphasising the male line of descent. Henry IV based his right to depose Richard II, since it was argued that the heir was presumed to be Edward Mortimer, great-grandson of Edward III's second son Lionel. This, however, wasn't guaranteed, as Mortimer descended from the female line. The House of Beaufort, descending from Gaunt by his mistress Catherine Swynford, were originally illegitimate, but under an Act of Parliament were legitimised. Henry IV would exclude them from the line of succession. The Yorkist claim came from Edward's fourth son, Edmund of Langley, and younger brother of John of Gaunt. This claim was based upon the female line of descent and the descendants of Lionel. Langley's second son, named Richard, had married Anne de Mortimer, daughter of Roger Mortimer, and sister to Edmund. During the 14th century, the Mortimers were the most powerful of the marchers in Wales. G.M. Trevelyan would write that the Wars of the Roses were, to a large extent, a quarrel between Welsh marcher lords, who were also great English nobles, closely related to the English throne. The question of succession would begin following Edward III's death in 1377, and is said by Mortimer to be the root cause to the conflict. While it may be easy to assume that Edward's succession was secure, that was anything but by the time of Edward's death. His two eldest, the Black Prince and Lionel, had died before Edward, leaving only John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and Thomas of Woodstock. The Black Prince, however, had one surviving son, Richard, who held the claim to the throne. This was down to the matter that the firstborn and heir to the throne had priority of succession. This made Richard's claim stronger than any of Edward's sons. However, Richard was but a boy, and his 3 uncles all held ambitions and power, meaning it was anyone's game to seat the throne. This instability would lead to Richard II's coronation at just 10 years of age. Under primogeniture law, should Richard die, then his heir would be the descendants from Lionel, being Edward III's second eldest. Lionel had a daughter, Philippa, who would go on to marry into the Mortimer family and bring a boy, Roger Mortimer, who now held the best legal claim to the throne. A decree issued by Edward wouldn't make this so, limiting his succession to the male line, making John of Gaunt hold a stronger claim than Roger Mortimer. Richard II, also under the title Richard of Bordeaux, would reign until his deposition in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's son. Later, Henry would become Henry IV, the first Lancastrian monarch. Almost immediately, Henry faced a counter deposition called the Epiphany Rising in 1400. This uprising was led by John Montague, 3rd Earl of Salisbury, John Holland, 1st Duke of Exeter, Thomas Holland, 1st Duke of Surrey, and Thomas Despencer, 1st Earl of Gloucester. This attempt to put Richard back on the throne failed, and all 4 of the conspirators were executed, with Richard II dying by unknown means shortly after. The Welsh were fond of Richard, and when Henry ascended, Owain Glyndwr would spark a rebellion to be the largest in Welsh history. The rebellion would outlive Henry IV, not being crushed until 1415. During this period, Owain would receive help from members of the Tudors, a prominent Anglesey family and blood-related cousins to Owain himself. Over disputes of land, Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumbria, and Thomas Percy, 1st Earl of Worcester, would rebel multiple times against Henry IV. The first of these 2 threats for the king was silenced at Shrewsbury in 1403, where Thomas would be executed. The second would meet his end at Bramham Moor in 1408, where Henry would be killed. Henry IV would die in 1413, allowing his son, Henry of Monmouth, to become Henry V. To solidify control in his realm and in territory overseas, Henry V would revive the claim to the French throne. This allowed him to use the French support to Owain Glyndwr as a casus belli to invade France in 1415. Henry would use his victories at Harfleur and Agincourt to cement the legitimacy of the Lancastrian monarchy, along with Henry's claim to the throne of France. The Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting the Dauphin to the throne, marrying Catherine of Valois to Henry, and acknowledging Henry's children as rightful heirs of France. Henry had no doubts that the Lancastrian dynasty was secured, especially with his 3 younger brothers and recent marriage to Catherine. In 1421, Catherine birthed a child, the future Henry VI, and the following year, Henry V died of dysentery, allowing Henry VI to reign at just 9 months old. None of Henry's brothers produced living heirs, which left only the Beaufort family as suitable successors. With Richard of York growing in maturity and Henry VI's rule not looking any better, Richard's claim became ever more appealing, along with his revenue making him the wealthiest magnate within England. Henry VI finally came of age in 1437, 2 years after his regent, John, Duke of Bedford, had died. William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, was a prominent ally to the late Duke, and was a dominant personality within the court. William favoured diplomacy to sorting out the ever-failing situation in France, a stance which was favoured by the king. He was, however, opposed by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and the ever-rising Richard of York, whom both favoured continued military campaigns. Henry VI would direct more resources away from the military campaigns, leading Richard of York to hold a resentment for the Beauforts. William would continue to gain power by being a prominent architect for the Treaty of Tours in 1444, and successfully negotiating Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou. This was to be escalated when he had Humphrey in prison for treason, and he would die awaiting trial. This is a speculation that William had poisoned Humphrey. Henry VI would send Richard of York to have a 10-year as Lord of Ireland, wherein he couldn't influence court politics. William de la Pole's rise in power now came back to bite him. With continued defeat in France, he was in prime position to take blame. In 1450, he would be imprisoned in the Tower of London and impeached by Parliament. The king intervened, instead exiling William for 5 years. William was succeeded by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, as leader of the faction pursuing peace with France. England would lose the 100 Years' War, having been defeated at Castilian and losing everything except Calais. Upon hearing this, Henry would be sent into a complete mental breakdown, missing his son's birth. Edward. March 1454, Cardinal John Kemp, Lord Chancellor, had died, and Henry couldn't nominate a successor, making a government in the king's name an impossibility. A lack of central authority led to further deterioration in politics, which began to polarise along family feuds, particularly the Percy Neville feud and the Bonneville-Courtenay feud, creating the perfect conditions for civil war. A Regency Council was assembled, and, despite Margaret's protests, Richard of York was appointed Lord Protector. He would appoint his brother-in-law, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, as his Chancellor. In doing so, York gained Richard Neville, 6th Earl of Warwick, as an ally, one of the wealthiest magnates within England. York would then imprison Somerset within the Tower of London. The following year, Henry VI made a surprise recovery and undid much of York's progress. Somerset was released and restored to power, and York was exiled from court. The Earl of Salisbury would back the rival claim by the House of York to control all of government. Henry, Somerset, and a select few nobles held a grand council in Leicester in May, away from the enemies in London. Fearing charges of treason, York and his allies gathered an army to intercept the royal party at St Alban before they had a chance to reach the council.